"You do not belong here," my mother whispered, as she slid the sealed envelope across the table, her eyes cold in a way I had never seen before. Inside was proof that everything I believed about my family was built on a lie, and somehow I was the only one who did not know. That night I realized blood loyalty meant nothing in this house. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from, and if you have ever felt betrayed by family. Stay with me, subscribe, and let us uncover what happened next. My name is Evelyn Carter, and until that night I believed I understood my place in the family. We lived in Seattle in a glass-walled house that overlooked the water, the kind of place that looked calm from the outside but carried tension in every room. My mother Lorraine was known in our social circle as composed, charitable, and quietly powerful. My younger brother Adrian was the golden child, and I was the one who worked. I had spent years building a financial consulting career, eventually joining the very firm that managed our family investments. It felt like loyalty. It felt like responsibility. What I did not realize was that it also made me useful. The envelope she gave me that night contained copies of internal documents. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I noticed my name. Accounts had been opened under my authorization. Transfers had been made through channels I had access to. Funds were quietly redirected from our family trust into shell accounts. At first glance, it looked like embezzlement, and on paper, it looked like I was responsible. I remember sitting there, staring at the numbers, the signatures, the timestamps. Everything aligned too perfectly, too clean, like someone had built a narrative and carefully placed me at the center. "I thought you deserved to know before this becomes public," my mother said calmly, folding her hands as if we were discussing dinner plans. "We can still fix this quietly if you cooperate." Cooperate. That word echoed in my head long after she left the room. The next morning, I went into the office early. I needed answers before panic could settle in. My colleague, Marcus, noticed immediately that something was wrong. He had always been observant, the kind of person who read people better than spreadsheets. "You look like you did not sleep," he said. "I need access to archived transaction logs," I replied, skipping any pretense. He hesitated. "That is restricted." "I have clearance." He looked at me for a long second, then nodded. As I dug into the records, a pattern began to emerge. The transactions were real. The accounts were real. But the timing did not match my activity logs. Someone had mirrored my credentials. And then I found something else. The approval chain included my brother. Adrian had never worked in finance. He barely understood basic accounting. Yet there he was, listed as a secondary reviewer on multiple transactions. It made no sense until it did. Family favoritism had always been subtle in our house. Adrian was protected, excused, praised. I was expected to perform. Now I understood why. I was not just the responsible one. I was the one who could take the fall. That evening I confronted my mother again. "You set me up," I said, placing the documents on the table between us. She did not flinch. "Do not be dramatic. These transactions were routed through accounts I did not authorize. Adrian is listed on approvals he cannot even understand." Her expression hardened. "Adrian is family. You should be protecting him." "And I am not." "You are replaceable," she said quietly. "He is not." That sentence broke something in me. Years of subtle contempt suddenly made sense. The dismissive comments, the way my achievements were minimized, the way Adrian's failures were reframed as potential. I had spent my life trying to earn a place that was never meant for me. "You are asking me to take the blame," I said slowly. "I am asking you to preserve the family," she replied. There it was. The truth stripped of any pretense. I left that conversation with a clarity I had never felt before. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a mistake. This was a deliberate, calculated betrayal. And if they thought I would quietly accept it, they had underestimated me completely. The first thing I did was stop reacting. If there was one thing my job had taught me, it was that panic makes people predictable. And predictable people are easy to control. I was done being controlled. Instead of confronting anyone else, I began documenting everything. Every email, every transaction, every discrepancy. Marcus became my first ally, though I did not tell him everything at once. "I think someone is using internal credentials to move money," I told him. "That is not possible without detection," he replied. "It is happening." He studied me carefully, then said, "Then you need proof that cannot be dismissed." That became our focus. We worked late nights, reconstructing timelines, cross-referencing login locations, identifying inconsistencies in authorization patterns. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. This was not just about my family. This was fraud at an institutional level. And then we found the key piece. a hidden audit log that recorded manual overrides. The entries showed that my credentials had been accessed from a private network linked to a property owned by my mother. The same timestamps aligned with the transactions in question. It was undeniable. I remember staring at the screen, my hands trembling slightly. This was the moment everything changed. I was no longer defending myself. I was building a case. The next step was the hardest. Going public. Our firm had strict protocols for reporting internal fraud, but this situation was complicated. Reporting it would not just implicate my family, it would expose the firm's vulnerabilities. It would be messy, it would be loud, and it would be irreversible. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Marcus asked. "If I do not, they will destroy me," I said. "And they will do it again." We filed a formal report. Within hours, the atmosphere in the office shifted. Meetings were called, access was restricted, people whispered. By the end of the day, I was summoned to a conference room. My mother was already there. So was Adrian. And so were the firm's senior partners. Lorraine sat perfectly composed, as if she had anticipated this moment. "I am disappointed," she said softly when I entered. "I thought we handled this privately." "You tried to bury it," I replied. The lead partner cleared his throat. "We have reviewed the preliminary report. The allegations are serious." "They are also accurate," I said, placing the printed audit logs on the table. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in my mother's eyes. Adrian shifted uncomfortably. "This proves nothing," my mother said quickly. "Credentials can be manipulated." "Yes," I replied, which is why I included network origin data timestamp verification in override logs. Silence filled the room. The partner picked up the documents, scanning them carefully. "This indicates unauthorized access originating from your private network," he said, looking directly at my mother. Her composure cracked just slightly. "You are accusing me of fraud?" she asked, her voice tightening. "I am presenting evidence," I said calmly. The difference mattered, and everyone in that room felt it. For the first time in my life, the narrative was no longer controlled by her. It was controlled by the truth, and the truth was finally starting to surface. Public exposure did not bring relief, it brought war. By the next morning, my badge access had been suspended, pending review. My inbox had been locked, and a rumor had already started making its way through the office that I had manipulated evidence to protect myself. It was exactly the kind of move my mother would make. She never denied reality outright when she could poison it instead. If she could not erase the truth, she would make people too confused to trust it. I stood outside the building where I had spent years proving myself and watched employees pass by without meeting my eyes. Some looked sympathetic. Most looked afraid. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I needed their approval, but because fear had always been the air my family breathed. Even in a professional setting, my mother knew how to turn silence into a weapon. Marcus met me at a coffee shop 3 blocks away, one quiet enough to avoid our coworkers, but close enough that he could still slip back if anyone asked where he had gone. "They are moving fast," he said, sliding his laptop across the table. "Someone from executive compliance accessed the report at dawn, and then a revised internal memo went out, suggesting that the breach may have originated from your remote credentials." I stared at the screen. "They are framing the investigation before it even begins." "Yes," he said, "and someone inside is helping them." That was the moment I understood the scale of what I was up against. This was no longer just family betrayal wrapped in legal documents. This was influence, status, reputation, and money, all pulling in one direction to crush one person who had finally said no. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt something colder and steadier. Good, I thought. Let them show their hands. We needed allies, but not the kind that smiled and whispered support in hallways. We needed people with positions, records, and reasons to tell the truth, even when it cost them something. The first person I reached out to was Naomi Reyes, a former internal auditor at the firm who had resigned a year earlier under vague circumstances. I remembered her because she had once pulled me aside after a meeting and said very quietly, "Be careful what your family asks you to normalize." At the time, I thought she was being dramatic. Now I wondered how much she had already seen. She agreed to meet in a public library, reading room surrounded by law students and old men turning newspaper pages. She arrived in a charcoal coat, sharp-eyed and controlled, like someone who had learned not to waste emotion where facts would do more damage. "You were right," I told her. She gave me a look that held no satisfaction. I did not want to be. I explained what I had found. The forged authorizations, the shell accounts, Adrian's name on approvals he never should have touched. My mother's network tied to the override logs. the quiet smear campaign now building around me. Naomi listened without interrupting. When I finished, she reached into her bag and placed a slim folder on the table. I kept copies, she said. My pulse kicked hard. Of what? Flagged review summaries. Unusual internal transfers. Recommendations that disappeared after being escalated. I resigned because every time I got close to certain accounts, I was warned to step back. Your family name came up more than once, never directly, always through side channels and off-the-record conversations. I opened the folder and felt the floor shift under me. The patterns stretched back much farther than I knew. This had not started recently. This had been running quietly for years, maybe longer, using trust structures, real estate holdings, investment vehicles, and carefully selected personnel to move assets while keeping accountability scattered. My mother had not just set me up in a moment of panic. She had prepared for years to make me disposable. Naomi leaned forward. You need more than proof of one false trail. You need motive, method, and continuity. A story that shows this was deliberate and repeated. Marcus nodded slowly. A chain. Yes, Naomi said. A chain nobody can explain away. She became our second ally. The third came from somewhere I never expected. His name was Daniel Mercer, my mother's former attorney. He contacted me through a private email address with a message so brief it almost looked fake. Your mother made a mistake. If you want to understand it, meet me alone. I almost deleted it. Then Naomi read it, looked up and said, he is scared. That makes him useful. We met Daniel at a hotel lounge that smelled like polished wood and expensive caution. He looked exhausted, not physically, but morally, like a man who had spent too long calling compromise strategy. I am not here because I suddenly grew a conscience, he said before I could speak. I am here because Lorraine believes she can bury everyone who ever protected her. I do not enjoy being treated as debris. That told me everything I needed to know about him. He was not noble. He was cornered. In a story like mine that still counted. He confirmed that my mother had been restructuring family holdings for months after my grandfather's health declined. Asset titles had shifted. Trustee powers had been rewritten. Contingency documents had been prepared in case of litigation. My name, he admitted, had appeared in private discussions more than once as the logical absorbing point of exposure. I let that phrase sit between us. The absorbing point, I repeated. You mean the person she planned to sacrifice? He did not answer. He did not need to. What changed, I asked. His jaw tightened. She decided to cut me out after I advised restraint. Then she suggested indirectly but unmistakably that any attempt I made to protect myself would be interpreted as professional misconduct. I prefer not to be extorted by my own clients. Naomi asked the next question before I could. Do you have documents? A few, he said. Enough to establish intent, not enough to win by themselves. Intent is a start, she replied. He passed over copies of estate revision drafts, trustee correspondence, and notes from closed-door meetings that showed my mother pushing aggressively to consolidate control after my grandfather became more isolated. Adrian's future had been discussed constantly. My role was described in colder language: useful, stable, practical, manageable. Manageable. I had been loved only as long as I was easy to use. By then, the alliance was no longer theoretical. It was real. Marcus understood the technical architecture of the fraud. Naomi understood institutional cover-ups. Daniel understood how my mother buried liability under polished legal language. I understood the family itself. The emotional pressure points, the old myths, the places where affection had always been conditional. Still, we were missing one thing. We needed someone from inside the family who could not be dismissed as bitter, disloyal, or financially motivated. I did not think such a person existed. Then my Aunt Sylvia called. Sylvia was my mother's older sister. A woman long treated like an embarrassing side note at family events because she had divorced young, lived modestly, and refused to perform wealth the way the rest of them did. As a child, I adored her. As an adult, I was taught to see her as unstable. Looking back, I realized unstable was the word my family used for anyone they could not control. I heard what Lorraine is saying about you, Sylvia said. It sounds familiar. I drove to her house that same evening. It was small, warm, and full of mismatched bookshelves. No one in my family ever praised it because it had no grand staircase and no strategic view. It felt more honest than any home I had grown up in. Sylvia made tea, sat across from me, and for the first time in days, someone looked at me with sorrow instead of calculation. She did this before she said. My hands stilled around the cup. To who? Sylvia held my gaze. To me. Not with finance. With inheritance. When our father was ill, Lorraine controlled access, controlled information, controlled the story. I was made to look erratic, ungrateful, unreliable. By the time the documents were finalized, my concerns sounded like jealousy. I walked away because I was too tired to spend my life proving I could see what everyone else pretended not to. Every word tightened the thread running through this entire family history. My mother had not invented this cruelty for me. She had perfected it on others. What do you have? Naomi asked. Sylvia stood, crossed the room, and returned with an old metal box. Inside were letters, photocopies, calendar pages, and handwritten notes, fragments on their own, patterned together, dates of restricted visits, mentions of document changes, observations about who was present and who was suddenly absent whenever decisions were made. This may not be enough for court, Sylvia said, but it is enough to show character, enough to show method. Enough to tell people that what happened to you did not happen in a vacuum. I looked around that room and realized something I had never had the language for before. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not obligation, not fear, not strategic loyalty. Presence, honesty, protection without ownership. That realization was almost too painful to hold. The pressure intensified over the next week. My mother's friends stopped calling. 2 industry contacts withdrew from projects they had already promised me. An anonymous online post appeared on a local finance forum, implying that I had a history of emotional instability. Someone sent old photographs of me leaving a medical clinic after a panic attack years earlier, as if private suffering could serve as evidence of fraud. It was vicious, personal, and methodical. At midnight one rainy Thursday, I sat at my kitchen table staring at those posts. The room lit only by my laptop screen, and for the first time since this began, I felt tired enough to doubt myself. Not the facts, never the facts, but the cost. I had lost my job, my reputation was under attack, my mother was turning my own history into ammunition. Adrian had still said nothing publicly. Not once, not even to deny what had been done in his name. Marcus came over uninvited after I stopped answering messages. He took one look at me and pulled the laptop closed. You are not losing, he said. I am drowning. That is not the same thing. I laughed once bitterly. They have more money, more influence, more reach. Yes, he said, and now they are panicking enough to overextend. Smear campaigns are not confidence, they are leakage. Naomi joined by video call a few minutes later. Sylvia was already on speaker. Somehow, without anyone announcing it, my kitchen had become command central, my war room, my refuge. Daniel sent over a final packet before dawn. Private notes indicating my mother had planned an emergency family board meeting at the foundation headquarters. Officially, it was to address trust stabilization and reputational continuity. Unofficially, it was where she would finalize control, present me as unstable, and push through protective measures before the external investigation caught up. She is trying to lock the doors before the fire reaches the hallway, Naomi said. Can we stop it? I asked. Naomi looked directly into the camera. Yes, but only if we strike in the room. That was the turning point. Not because we suddenly had certainty, but because I understood what came next. We were no longer gathering truth in the dark. We were preparing to walk it into the center of the family machine and force every smiling liar to look at it under bright light. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, my allies stayed. And for the first time, since my mother slid that envelope across the table and tried to erase me with a single sentence, I no longer felt alone. What I did not know yet was that one person at that table would sell us out before morning. Betrayal rarely announces itself with thunder. Most of the time, it arrives disguised as cooperation. The board meeting was set for Monday morning at the headquarters of the Mercer Family Foundation, a sleek downtown building my mother loved because it looked philanthropic from the outside and imperial from within. The invitation list included trustees, senior advisors, legal counsel, and a handful of family figures who had spent years pretending not to know how power moved behind closed doors. It was the perfect stage for Lorraine, polished, controlled, respectable. It was also the place where we planned to break her control in front of the exact people she needed most. By Sunday afternoon, our strategy was clear. Marcus would prepare the digital evidence chain and coordinate secure duplication so nothing could vanish once presented. Naomi would handle the institutional framing, showing that this was not just a family dispute but a pattern of financial misconduct and coercive concealment. Sylvia would speak to historical behavior and the inheritance manipulation from years earlier, giving the room a context too morally ugly to ignore. Daniel would authenticate legal drafts and intent records, and I would do the one thing my mother had built my whole life around preventing. I would speak without asking permission. There was a strange calm in having a plan. Not peace exactly. More like the stillness before surgery. Everyone knew pain was coming, but at least it would be purposeful. I should have noticed the weakness in the structure. Daniel had been useful, informed, even angry on our behalf in his own self-interested way. But anger is not the same thing as courage. I knew that. Naomi knew that. We should have accounted for it more aggressively. Instead, we made the mistake frightened people always hope they can afford once things start going well. We assumed a traitor would at least be loyal to fear. He was loyal to the highest bidder. The first sign came late Sunday night when Marcus called me from his car, his voice so flat it made my chest go cold. Our shared drive was accessed, he said, remotely. Someone copied the presentation structure and deleted 2 backup directories. I restored what I could, but whoever did it knew where to look. I stood up so fast my chair scraped the floor. Can you trace it? Not completely. The entry point was masked through a private relay, but I pulled a log fragment. It pinged through a firm Daniel used for outside counsel storage. For a moment, I could not speak. I had expected cruelty from my mother. I had expected silence from Adrian. I had even expected cowardice from the people orbiting the family name. But betrayal from inside the alliance hit differently because it tried to rot the one thing I had just begun to trust again. Are you sure? I asked. Marcus exhaled hard. As sure as I can be before sunrise, he sold us. I called Daniel immediately, no answer. Again, no answer. Then a message came through short enough to make me feel physically ill. I had to protect myself. Do not go tomorrow. She is ready for you. No apology, no explanation, no denial. Just surrender dressed as practicality. Naomi arrived at my apartment 20 minutes later with Sylvia behind her, both still in coats. I showed them the message. Sylvia sat down slowly like someone who had seen the script before and hated that she recognized the pacing. He told her what we had, I said. Naomi's expression did not change, which meant she was furious. Not everything. He did not have everything, but enough to warn her. Marcus joined by laptop from his apartment, lines of code reflected in his glasses. The main evidence still stands. The problem is strategy. If Lorraine knows what we plan to present, she will preempt, discredit, isolate, and move for procedural delay. She will come armed, Sylvia said quietly. She always does, I replied. For a few minutes, nobody spoke. Rain tapped the windows. The clock above my stove sounded louder than it ever had before. It would have been easy in that moment to cancel, to retreat, to say we would regroup after the investigation advanced, to protect what little remained of my public standing and avoid a direct collision I might lose in front of an audience built to admire my mother. That was exactly what Lorraine expected me to do. Fear had trained her whole life to believe other people would back away first. I looked at the people still in my apartment at nearly 1 a.m, and something inside me settled. We go, I said. Marcus looked up sharply. Even with compromised positioning, yes. Naomi nodded once, then we changed the battlefield. The hours before dawn blurred into motion. Marcus restructured the presentation into separate encrypted packets so no single disruption could destroy the whole case. Naomi drafted a concise opening statement, centered not on accusation, but on fiduciary duty, evidence preservation, and immediate independent review. Sylvia reorganized her documents into a linear narrative that any trustee could understand. I rewrote my own remarks from scratch, stripping away anything emotional enough to be used against me, and keeping only what mattered. Fact, sequence, motive, pattern, harm. At sunrise, I changed clothes twice before choosing a navy suit I had worn the day I first made partner track. Not because I wanted symbolism, but because I wanted to remember the woman I had been before my family tried to turn competence into a liability. The foundation headquarters looked almost beautiful in the morning light. Glass, stone, clean metal lines. The kind of building that told donors their money was safe and told employees that power had no need to raise its voice. Security stopped me in the lobby. Your name is not cleared for today's meeting, the guard said, polite enough to make it humiliating. Naomi stepped forward before I could answer and handed over a letter on legal stationery. As a named party in pending allegations affecting trust governance, she has standing. The guard hesitated, made a call, and finally stepped aside. That alone told me my mother had prepared. Upstairs, the boardroom doors were open. Trustees sat in polished silence. Advisors murmured in low tones. My mother stood near the head of the table, speaking with calm authority, dressed in cream and steel-colored silk. Like composure itself had chosen a wardrobe. Adrian sat 2 seats down, face pale, jaw tense, staring at nothing. When she saw me enter, her expression changed just enough for me to catch it. Not surprise, annoyance. As if I were a scheduling inconvenience she had failed to remove. "Evelyn," she said, voice warm enough to fool strangers. "I was told you might need more time before participating in family matters." I took my seat. That was generous. I did not ask for it. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Good. Let discomfort live where secrecy had lived. The meeting opened with procedural language so bland it almost felt surreal. Reputation risk, governance continuity, asset preservation. My mother spoke first, framing recent events as distressing misunderstandings compounded by internal professional instability. She did not use my name at first. She did not need to. The implication hung over the room like perfume. Then she did something I had not expected. She produced a packet of papers and passed them around the table. Medical notes, old therapy billing summaries, a leave request from years ago after I had a stress-related collapse during a brutal quarter at work. My stomach dropped, then burned. "She has been under pressure for some time," my mother said softly, each word measured for maximum concern. "I say this with compassion. Our family has done everything possible to support her privately. But when personal strain becomes public accusation, we must act responsibly." It was evil in the most socially acceptable register, not rage, not insult, concern, weaponized concern, the kind that invites others to feel virtuous while joining in execution. One trustee looked at me with pity, another with suspicion. Adrian still said nothing. Naomi rose before I could. "This is irrelevant, invasive, and legally precarious," she said. "If this board intends to discuss mental health records in place of financial evidence, it should be advised that such conduct will itself become part of the investigative file." That checked the room for a moment, but not enough. My mother had seeded the doubt she wanted. Then came the second blow. Daniel walked in. He was late on purpose, carrying a leather folder and the expression of a man trying to look neutral while crossing a minefield. He did not meet my eyes. He went directly to my mother's side. There it was, the full betrayal made visible. Lorraine did not smile. She did not need to. Her victory sat in the room like a private fragrance. For clarity, she said, "Mr. Mercer has agreed to address certain documents that have been taken out of context by distressed parties." My throat tightened so hard it hurt. Daniel began speaking in the careful, bloodless tone of a lawyer laundering intent through ambiguity. Drafts were exploratory. Language was preliminary. Internal contingency planning was common. Nothing demonstrated wrongdoing. Nothing demonstrated sacrificial targeting. Nothing demonstrated deliberate fraud. Concern had been exaggerated. Interpretation had become accusation. He was not just abandoning us. He was cleaning the knife. I looked at Sylvia. Her mouth had gone thin with disgust. Marcus, seated at the far end as a technical witness, kept his face unreadable. Naomi wrote one sentence on a legal pad and turned it toward me. "Do not react to humiliation, react to the lie." That line saved me, because humiliation was exactly what my mother wanted. A crack, a raised voice. One visible sign that I was what she had already implied: unstable, emotional, unreliable. If I gave her that, everything else would blur. So when Lorraine turned to me and said with devastating softness, "Evelyn, you have always had difficulty distinguishing hurt from fact," I did not answer her. I stood, placed both hands on the table, and addressed the trustees. "My mother just distributed private health material to distract you from financial evidence," I said. "That alone should tell you what kind of meeting this is." Silence. I kept going. "You do not have to like me. You do not have to trust me. You do not even have to care about this family. But if you are trustees, directors, or advisors with fiduciary responsibilities, then you should care that emotional smear tactics are being used to obstruct review of account transfers, credential misuse, and estate restructuring tied to this foundation's leadership." One of the trustees, an older woman named Helen Broderick, finally spoke. Do you have proof in this room right now that misconduct occurred? I turned to Marcus. He plugged in a secure drive. The main screen flickered, then went black. For 1 second, nobody moved. Then Marcus tried again. Nothing. Another screen prompt. Access denied. Corrupted package. Unauthorized modification detected. Daniel had not just warned Lorraine. He had given her enough information to sabotage our primary presentation sequence. The room shifted instantly. Not visibly, not dramatically, but I felt it. Confidence draining. Suspicion rising. My mother folded her hands calm as a queen at a failed rebellion. Marcus whispered, "They hit the packet architecture." Naomi stepped forward with printed materials, but trustees were already exchanging looks. Paper felt weaker now, smaller, easier to dismiss. Adrian finally spoke, and somehow that hurt worst of all. "This has gone too far," he said, eyes fixed on the table. "I never wanted any of this." I stared at him. "Then why did you sign the approvals?" His head snapped up. "I signed what I was told were administrative placeholders." Lorraine cut in sharply. "Adrian, do not engage." But the sentence was out, and it mattered. Naomi heard it too. So did Helen. "You signed financial approvals you did not understand," Helen asked. Adrian hesitated. My mother answered for him. "Routine family office processing, nothing more." The moment could have turned in our favor. Instead, Daniel slid another document forward. "For the record, there is also concern that Ms. Carter may have independently accessed restricted internal systems after suspension, potentially contaminating evidentiary integrity." It was breathtaking. He was trying to make our attempt to preserve proof look like tampering. That was the blow that landed. Not because it was true. Because it was complicated enough to delay action and dirty enough to damage me. Trustees love delay. Institutions survive on it. Delay lets cowards call themselves careful. Helen called for temporary adjournment and outside review. No emergency vote. No immediate removal. No public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just procedural suspension and internal containment. My mother had not won everything, but I had not won either. As the meeting dissolved into clusters of whispered conversation, she approached me at last. Up close, she looked almost serene. "I gave you a chance to leave quietly," she said. "Now everyone has seen exactly why that would have been kinder." I should have answered. I had 1,000 sharp things in me. Instead, I looked at Daniel standing near the wall, unable to meet my eyes, and then at Adrian, pale and shaken, and then back at my mother. And I understood the shape of the defeat. This was not total collapse, it was worse. It was a public stumble that let her pretend the fight remained undecided while she tightened control behind the scenes. My reputation had taken another hit. Our main presentation had been compromised. Daniel was back in her orbit. Trustees were retreating into caution. And people who had doubted me now had fresh reasons to keep doubting. Temporary defeat. The kind that makes people disappear. In the elevator down, nobody spoke until the doors closed. Then Sylvia said very quietly, "I'm sorry." Marcus looked wrecked. I should have anticipated the sabotage path. Naomi was already thinking 3 moves ahead, which was the only reason I stayed standing. "We lost the room," she said. "We did not lose the truth." I leaned back against the mirrored wall and stared at my own reflection. I looked composed, controlled, almost detached. Inside, I felt flayed open. "She turned my pain into evidence against me," I said. "Yes," Naomi replied. "And that is going to matter more than she realizes." I frowned. Why? Because some people in that room just watched her use family concern as camouflage for procedural abuse. People can ignore fraud longer than they can ignore cruelty when it is displayed too elegantly. She overplayed. I wanted to believe that, I truly did. But by the time I got home, 2 messages had already arrived from former colleagues advising me to step back from public allegations for my own well-being. Someone had leaked that I caused a scene at the foundation. Someone else implied I had become obsessed. The machine was running again, smooth as ever. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, shoes still on, lights off, city glow washing the room blue. For the first time since this began, I allowed myself to cry. Not because I thought she had beaten me forever. Because I finally understood what fighting her would cost. And then at nearly midnight, my phone lit up with a number I did not recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice said, "My name is Tessa Wynne. I used to work for your grandfather. I watched the board meeting online through an internal relay, and your mother just made a mistake she cannot survive. I have the records she thought were destroyed." I wiped my face and sat up. The defeat was real. But it was not the end. I almost did not trust the call. After Daniel's suspicion came easily, hope did not. Tessa Wynne understood that immediately. Her voice carried the flat patience of someone who had spent years around rich people and learned that truth was most valuable when delivered without drama. "You do not know me," she said, "but I was your grandfather's executive administrator for 11 years. I handled scheduling, document routing, restricted archives, and legacy correspondence. I left when access controls changed after his second hospitalization." "Why are you calling now?" I asked. "Because your mother thought destroying visible records was enough," she said. "It was not. Your grandfather did not trust digital systems the way she did. He believed in parallel files." That phrase snapped every nerve in me awake. Parallel files meant duplicates, independent records, a second trail beyond the one my mother had scrubbed. We met the next morning in a church office annex attached to a stone building north of downtown, a place so unconnected to my family's world that it felt strategically pure. Tessa was in her late 50s, impeccably organized with a leather tote and the posture of someone who had spent years making chaos look scheduled. She did not waste time. From the tote, she removed 3 bound folders, a flash drive, and a handwritten ledger book that looked old enough to matter. "Your grandfather had memory concerns toward the end," she said. "He also had trust concerns. He knew Lorraine was consolidating access. He did not always know how to stop it directly, so he created duplicate chains. One for official channels, one for his private review." My fingers hovered over the ledger. "You kept this." "I kept what I was told to preserve if anything ever felt wrong." "Did he say that exactly?" She looked at me and for the first time warmth entered her expression. "He said, and I quote, 'If my daughter starts arranging the furniture around the truth, make sure the girl who still asks direct questions gets the real map.'" The girl. Me. I had to look away for a second. My grandfather and I had not been openly close in the sentimental sense. My mother made sure access always felt structured. But I used to sit with him during summer visits and ask him why adults lied with such confidence. He would laugh and tell me that polished people were often the least secure. Somewhere quietly, he had remembered that. Tessa opened the first folder. Inside were appointment logs showing restricted visits during the period when estate documents changed. The second held routing slips that proved revised trust papers bypassed the normal review order and were handled only by Lorraine Daniel and one outside notary service. The third contained handwritten annotations by my grandfather, including one line that made Naomi, when I later showed her, go completely still. "Do not let A handle anything final without E present. L is pressing too fast." A was Adrian. E was me. L was Lorraine. It was not just concern. It was evidence of intent to exclude me. Then came the flash drive. Marcus nearly swore when he examined it later that day, which for him was the emotional equivalent of smashing a chair through a window. "It is a mirrored archive," he said. "Not complete, but close enough. Email snapshots, draft transfer justifications, scanned signatures, access logs, internal calendar notes. This is devastating." Naomi leaned in over his shoulder. "Can it be authenticated?" "Yes," he said. "Metadata cross-references with the fragments we already had. And because some files were saved through a disconnected backup process, they predate the later edits. This is clean." I sat at the edge of the table and tried to breathe normally while years of manipulation rearranged themselves into a visible shape. The records showed that Adrian had indeed signed approvals he did not understand, but that he had done so under explicit direction. My mother had treated him less like an architect and more like a decorative signature with inherited value. That did not make him innocent, but it changed the frame. More importantly, the records showed deliberate efforts to place my credentials near vulnerable transaction channels weeks before the fraudulent transfers appeared. There were internal notes discussing narrative resilience and containment through expected competence language so chillingly strategic it sounded like a political coup translated into family office jargon. And then we found the line that cracked the whole case open. In a private email to Daniel copied to one outside advisor, my mother wrote, "Evelyn is steady enough to survive impact. Adrian is not. In the event of exposure, practical daughters absorb what beloved sons cannot." Nobody in the room spoke for several seconds. Sylvia put a hand over her mouth. Marcus leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Naomi closed her eyes once briefly, like a person acknowledging the arrival of something terrible and useful at the same time. I just sat there, my whole life reduced to one sentence. Practical daughters absorb what beloved sons cannot. It explained everything. the standards, the contempt, the endless expectation that I would clean what Adrian broke, manage what others ignored, endure what made everybody else uncomfortable. It was not maternal confusion, it was doctrine. Tessa became the ally who changed everything. Unlike Daniel, she was not driven by self-preservation alone. Unlike Marcus, Naomi, or Sylvia, she came carrying the authority of memory from before my mother tightened control. She knew how rooms were managed, which signatures mattered, who had witnessed exclusions, and where paper trails had been hidden because powerful people assumed staff stopped existing once dismissed. She also had one final gift. The board meeting was streamed through the internal archival relay, she said. Not officially, but for record retention. Lorraine may have suppressed distribution. She did not erase the raw capture in time. My head lifted. You have it. I have a copy. That mattered because the footage would show my mother distributing private medical material in a governance meeting to undermine scrutiny. It would show Adrian admitting he signed what he did not understand. It would show Daniel recharacterizing documents he had previously described to us in very different terms. It would show the atmosphere, the sequencing, the control. Context is often the difference between allegation and proof. We moved fast. Naomi connected with an external regulatory council. She trusted someone outside the firm, outside the foundation, and crucially outside the gravitational field of my mother's donors. Marcus authenticated the mirrored archive and prepared affidavit support. Sylvia wrote a formal declaration on family inheritance manipulation, reaching back years. Tessa prepared her own statement with careful specificity. I assembled a master narrative, not emotional, not theatrical, just relentless. What happened? When it happened? Who benefited? How it was hidden? How it was redirected toward me? This time, we did not aim for a family boardroom. We aimed above it. The external filing went to regulators, the State Attorney General's Charitable Oversight Division, and the firm's independent risk committee with separate notice to the foundation trustees so they could not later pretend ignorance. Naomi insisted on simultaneous release. Nobody gets time to quietly warn Lorraine first, she said. Truth arrives everywhere at once. It was one of the longest mornings of my life. Once the materials were sent, there was nothing left to control. We sat in Sylvia's living room with coffee going cold and phones on the table between us like unexploded devices. No one tried to make small talk. Tessa read quietly. Marcus kept refreshing secure mail. Naomi paced by the window. Then the first reply came. Independent receipt confirmed. Immediate preservation order requested. Then another. Outside review council appointed. Trustees instructed not to destroy or alter records. Then another. State office acknowledges potential misuse of charitable assets and governance interference. Emergency inquiry opening. The room changed. Not celebration, not yet. But gravity shifted. My mother could bully employees, shame relatives, charm trustees, and manipulate Daniel until he mistook cowardice for strategy. She could not privately smother a multi-channel inquiry once authenticated evidence was already in too many hands. By late afternoon, Helen Broderick called me directly. Her voice was clipped formal and unmistakably different from how she sounded in the boardroom. I have reviewed the supplemental submission. I owe you this plainly. What was presented to the trustees Monday was materially incomplete. An emergency session has been called. Will Lorraine still control the room? I asked. Not this time, Helen said. I hung up and looked at Naomi. She knows, I said. Naomi gave the smallest, hardest smile. Good. The emergency session took place 2 days later, and unlike the first, it began with visible fracture. Trustees arrived with outside counsel. Phones were surrendered. Additional screens were brought in. Lorraine entered dressed for control, but even from across the room I could see the difference. She was no longer setting the terms. She was walking into terms already set. Adrian looked wrecked. Daniel looked absent in spirit, like a man who had discovered too late that selling one person out does not buy safety from the person who taught him to betray. Helen opened with the preservation order and announced that new documentary evidence had established probable misconduct requiring immediate cooperation. Then the mirrored archive began. Not our sabotaged presentation, not a dramatic speech, just records, metadata, email language, approval chains, routing bypasses, calendar restrictions, my grandfather's annotations, And then, my mother's sentence on the screen in black letters against white. Practical daughters absorb what beloved sons cannot. There are moments when rooms stop pretending. This was one of them. Adrian actually made a sound something between a breath and a break. He turned toward my mother, horrified in a way that finally looked real. "Did you write that?" he asked. Lorraine did not answer quickly enough. That was answer enough. Then came the boardroom footage. My medical records. Her performance of concern. Adrian's admission. Daniel's careful distortion. The sequence uninterrupted. When it ended, Helen spoke first. "This is abuse of governance process." Another trustee added, "and likely more than that." Daniel tried once weekly to reframe prior advice. Nobody followed him. The tide had turned too completely. My mother stood. Even then, she tried to recover command. "This family has been under strain," she said. "Private words are now being weaponized by bitter people who misunderstand what it takes to preserve legacy." I looked at her and realized that was the saddest part. Even now, facing collapse, she could not imagine a world where preservation was not morally superior to love. Helen did not let her continue. "You are removed from active authority pending full inquiry effective immediately." The words landed with a force that felt almost physical. Lorraine's face changed then. Not into remorse, into fury stripped of audience management. She turned to me. "You would burn everything for this." I stood. "No, I am the only reason any of it still deserves to survive." That was the moment victory began. Not the full ending, not justice complete, but reversal unmistakable and irreversible. By nightfall, regulators had formal access. The firm opened formal proceedings. The foundation froze discretionary movement authority. Daniel requested separate counsel. Adrian left me a voicemail I did not answer, crying for perhaps the first honest reason of his life. And I sat in Sylvia's kitchen while she set a plate of food in front of me. And Tessa quietly updated a checklist, and Marcus finally laughed from pure exhausted disbelief. I looked around that table and understood something that still makes my throat tighten when I think about it. The people who saved me were not the ones bound to me by blood status or obligation. They were the ones who chose truth when lying would have been easier. The final collapse had started. Now all that remained was to see what survived it. The end did not arrive in one dramatic explosion. It came as a sequence of doors closing. Some closed softly with signatures and notices, some slammed. Within a week, my mother had been formally suspended from all foundation authority, removed from interim control over multiple family entities, and named in parallel reviews, tied to fraudulent transfers, fiduciary interference, and evidence suppression. The firm, desperate to look less compromised than it was, terminated 2 compliance officers who had helped redirect scrutiny and publicly announced an independent restructuring of internal controls. Donors began asking questions. Journalists began circling. Friends who had once praised Lorraine's elegance suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts and moral boundaries. Reputation, I learned, abandons people much faster than truth. Adrian was forced into interviews with investigators and outside counsel. For the first time in his life, no one translated consequences into softer language for him. He had signed documents he did not understand because he trusted our mother, and because being favored had taught him that understanding was optional. He was not charged as the architect of the scheme, but he lost voting standing in the family office, access to discretionary accounts, and whatever remained of the illusion that charm could substitute for character. He called me repeatedly. I did not answer until the 7th call. His voice was raw when I finally picked up. "I did not know she would do this to you." I stood by my apartment window looking at a city I felt I had aged 10 years inside. "You did not want to know." Silence. Then very quietly, "That is true." That honesty almost hurt more than denial would have. "I spent my whole life thinking you were stronger because you could handle what she said." He continued. "I told myself you did not need protecting." I closed my eyes. "No. You told yourself I was built to absorb what would have crushed you." He started crying then, and I felt nothing simple in response. Not triumph, not comfort. Grief, maybe. Grief for the children we had been in a house where one child was worshipped and the other was trained for impact. "I cannot forgive you today," I said. "Maybe not for a long time. But I need you to understand something. Silence is a choice. Every time." He whispered, "I know." That was the last truly honest conversation we had for months. As for Daniel, his collapse was quieter and somehow more pathetic. He resigned from 3 advisory roles within 10 days, issued a statement through counsel that satisfied no one, and became the kind of man powerful circles suddenly forget to invite. He wrote to me once, a message heavy with self-justification and professional regret. I deleted it after the first paragraph. Some betrayals do not need closure, they need distance. The legal consequences continued to unfold through official channels, and I will not pretend I enjoyed every part of it with saintly detachment. There was satisfaction in watching my mother's certainty fracture under procedures she could not charm. There was satisfaction in seeing records she thought buried become the reason she lost control. There was satisfaction in hearing one trustee describe her conduct off the record, but clearly enough as aristocratic predation disguised as stewardship. Justice is not always clean. Sometimes it is deeply humanly satisfying. Still, the real turning point for me did not happen in a boardroom or legal office. It happened 3 weeks later in a hospital corridor. My grandfather had been moved to a quieter long-term care wing during the upheaval, partly for privacy and partly because too many staff members had become nervous about who was authorized to visit him. With my mother's restrictions lifted, I was finally able to see him alone. He looked smaller than I remembered, and sharper too, like age had taken force but not instinct. For a while we just sat together while afternoon light moved across the floor. Then he asked in a voice thinner than memory, but unmistakably his, "Did she finally mistake you for weak?" I laughed before I could stop myself, and suddenly I was crying. "Yes," I said. He nodded once. That was always going to be her fatal habit. I told him enough for him to understand. Not every detail, not every cruelty, just the shape of it. He listened with his eyes closed, fingers resting on the blanket. When I finished, he said I should have done more sooner. I shook my head. "You left a map. Not the same thing." "No," I said, "but it helped me get out." That mattered to him. I could see it. Before I left, he squeezed my hand with surprising strength and said, "A family name is only worth keeping if it survives honesty. Otherwise, it is just varnish." For years, I had thought surviving my family meant proving I deserved to remain inside it. That day, I understood survival differently. Sometimes surviving means refusing the role that was written for you. Sometimes it means letting the structure collapse rather than offering your back to hold it up one more year. The public part of the scandal burned hot for a while and then cooled, as these things do. A local business paper ran a piece about governance irregularities at the foundation. An industry newsletter covered the compliance failures at the firm. The family did what powerful families always do when their secrets become expensive. They called it unfortunate. They called it complex. They called it a painful private matter. Nobody called it what it was with full accuracy except the people who had lived through it. Abuse, fraud, betrayal, sacrifice planned as strategy. I rebuilt slowly. At first, that looked unimpressive from the outside. I slept more. I changed my number. I stopped scanning every room for the person most likely to weaponize kindness. I started consulting independently on a smaller scale, advising nonprofit boards on governance risk and internal accountability. It was Naomi's idea, though she framed it more bluntly. "You have a rare skill set now," she told me over lunch one day. "You can smell respectable corruption before it finishes putting on perfume." I laughed so hard I nearly embarrassed us both. Marcus helped me set up systems. Sylvia kept feeding me like recovery was a logistical problem to solve with soup and stubbornness. Tessa became the kind of friend who appears with precisely labeled folders and leaves with your houseplants somehow healthier than before. Naomi remained flinty, brilliant, and unexpectedly protective in ways she would deny under oath. That was my chosen family, though none of us said the phrase aloud at first because it sounded too sentimental for the people we were. Then one Sunday evening, we were all at Sylvia's house for dinner. Nothing formal. Roast chicken, burnt edges on the potatoes, too much pie. Marcus and Tessa were arguing about document retention best practices, as if that were casual conversation. Naomi was pretending not to enjoy herself. Sylvia was laughing in the kitchen. I looked around and felt something open in me that had been locked for so long I no longer knew its shape. Safety. Not perfect safety, not permanent, but real. Nobody at that table needed me to absorb their damage in order to earn my place. I was there because I was wanted. That changed everything. Months later, after initial findings hardened into formal outcomes, I received the final notice regarding my mother's removal from the remaining trust authorities still under review. There would be more proceedings, more details, more consequences to calculate. But the central truth was settled. Her crimes were exposed. Her control was broken. The daughter she called replaceable had become the witness she could not outrun. I printed the notice, folded it once, and put it in a drawer I do not open often. Not because I fear it, because I do not need to keep staring at proof of what I already survived. As for my mother, people always ask versions of the same question when they hear stories like mine. Did she apologize? Did she admit it? Did karma feel dramatic enough? The answer is less theatrical and more devastating. She never gave me the kind of apology movies train people to expect. What she lost was far more revealing than words. She lost control. She lost narrative ownership. She lost the ability to decide who counted and who was disposable. For a woman like Lorraine, that was the truest collapse possible. And me, I stopped begging hostel rooms to call me family. I stopped treating endurance like a personality. I stopped confusing usefulness with love. That is the lesson I carry now, and maybe it is the one someone listening to me needs too when a family system survives by choosing one person to absorb the weight of everybody else's lies. Walking away is not betrayal. Telling the truth is not cruelty. Refusing to disappear is not selfishness. Sometimes justice begins the moment you reject the role designed to destroy you. So now I want to ask you something that comes straight out of everything I lived through. Have you ever been treated like the one who was expected to stay quiet, stay useful, and carry the damage, so the rest of the family could keep pretending? And when truth finally showed up, did karma arrive all at once, or did justice come slowly? One consequence at a time. Tell me in the comments, because I know stories like this do not belong to me alone. If this journey stayed with you, please like this video, so more people who are trapped in silence can find it. Subscribe if you want more stories about family betrayal, hard-earned justice, and the kind of lessons people only learn after surviving the worst rooms in their lives. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that blood does not excuse cruelty, and being chosen by honest people can heal what betrayal broke. Thank you for staying with me through this story. I truly mean that. Wherever you are watching from, I hope your life brings you clear eyes, safe people, strong boundaries, and the courage to believe your truth before a manipulator tells you who you are.